Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English. We have just finished a study of Dante's Inferno, and now it is time for us to do a little bit of a review. So we're going to do several things in this lecture. We're going to look backwards at where we've been, and we're going to look forwards at where we are still wanting to go. Now, if you haven't been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, my assumption for this lecture is that you have been working with us all the way from our Edith Hamilton material up, including all the way through the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, as well as our study of Chaucer, our study of St. Augustine's Confessions, and now, of course, our study of Dante's Inferno. We're now getting ready for our study of Shakespeare, and so this is in some ways kind of a bridge lecture for you as AP students between the two. Now, of course, Dante, I think, would very much approve, as I said several times in my lectures of Inferno, very much approve of the idea that it makes sense at moments in our academic development, our intellectual development, to pause for a moment and kind of take stock of where we've been and where we're going. Now, let's think a little bit about the epic and the ways in which we began our time together by saying that in some really interesting and fundamental way, we are the stories that we tell each other. We're the stories that we retell each other. We're the stories that we accept once those stories have been told to us. And we're also the stories that we reject. There comes a moment in the history of the world when certain stories are no longer accepted in the ways that they were once accepted. And that tension, of course, is always fundamental to how we look at these poems, these epics, right? Of course, what are epics? Well, let's just do some quick listing of things. And again, all of this is review. I know you already know all of this. Well, epics are, of course, the things a culture values. The national anthem, we have sometimes said, when we studied Beowulf and we talked about the Anglo-Saxon code, for example, you know, there it is, right? When we talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, we talked about Kleos and Time, the ideas of Scooby Snacks and fame, right, and all of that. And, of course, no question, the epic will as well tell us about those three important value spheres of arts, morals, and science. What we treasure in terms of entertainment, arts, what we consider important in terms of morals, ethics are the way we behave, and then, of course, finally, the science of our culture. In other words, how do we explain the phenomena that we obviously see? I mean, if you'll think about it, these value spheres are clearly treated in each one of these texts that we looked at. We'll obviously spend some time thinking about this as it relates to Dante and Inferno here in a second. Notice, just to continue though, these texts also, they are poems, right? That is to say, they're narratives. They narrate certain kinds of stories. There is a definite beginning, a middle, and an end, although we'll never say definite about any one of those beginnings, middles, and ends. And we debate, of course, always the end. One of the difficulties of reading and teaching the Inferno to you is that you haven't finished the other two poems, the canticles, the Purgatorio and Paradiso. And so there's no such thing as really an end at all. I mean, the fact that they, get out of hell doesn't mean a lot if you haven't read the other two parts. My hope is that at least you're motivated to take a look at the other two parts of the Divine Commedia. Of course, these epics, as we have said repeatedly from the very beginning, and I think this is often overlooked, we have to remind ourselves, these are religious texts. Some scholars will argue, first and foremost, these are religious texts. Think about the Invocation of the Muse, for example, when even Dante will play that game as well, won't he? Of course, these epics are also records of language play. We mentioned Wittgenstein before, play and development. In other words, when we look at these poems, we have a tendency to begin to kind of ask questions about what is going on with language. The fact that Dante, for example, decides to write in the Italian of the street is, I think, fundamentally important. We said the same thing about Chaucer, making his decision to write in that language that we will later call Chaucerian English, that Middle English, right? Now, of course, we've looked at all these epics as well from different perspectives. Think of it as poetry, politics, and philosophy. From the perspective of poetry, we've spent a lot of time at level 2B thinking about poetic technique, simile metaphor, symbolism, irony, word choice, all of that stuff, figurative language. All that stuff that good AP students obviously have to learn if they're going to do well on the AP exam. And as well, it, I think, enriches the reading of the text for us to ask about the symbolism or the irony, for example, in a certain canto of Inferno. But no question, all of these texts have had their political element as well. That is to say, related to the polis. And one of the reasons that we did our study of Plato and the Apology and Republic, and of course our study of Marcus Aurelius and his meditations, our study as well of other kinds of issues like other kinds of texts like Machiavelli's Prince. I mean, that's really important for us as well, right? So all of those, that very political orientation, right? Notice as well, for example, a political reading of these texts will ask things about, for example, treatment of women in the patriarchy, or for example, how does economics somehow understood within this notion? For example, think about it. Dante will say what's wrong with Florence, and by extension all of Italy, is that there's too much greed. Everybody cares too much about money and not enough about spiritual development and God. Of course, these texts all as well will emphasize those four elements of philosophy that we've always spoken about. Ontology, the idea of who you are. Epistemology, the idea of what you can know. Psychology, the way the individual mind works. And sociology, the way collections of minds work when we get a group of people together. And of course, all of these poems that we've been looking at inform us in fundamental ways about the way that culture views individuals ontologically, epistemologically. Of course, when we talk about epistemology, you'll remember we already commented on those kind of two extremes epistemologically. Absolute certainty, right? And of course, a lot of people will say there's problems with absolute certainty. People do kind of crazy things sometimes when they believe they have absolute certainty. I mean, the tragedy in our nation's history is, of course, airplanes get flown into buildings and lots of people die because of a certain kind of absolute certainty, right? But then there's that other side of the spectrum, epistemologically, the relativist position. There are no absolutes. There are no truths. Of course, the moment that we say there are no truths, it seems like we're postulating a truth. The moment we say there are no absolutes, it seems like we're positing an absolute. And to that degree, well, we've got problems because that's what we call the performative contradiction, which moves us kind of back to the center epistemologically. That is to say, the fallibilist position, which is the position of we have suggested makes the most sense here. It isn't an absolutist position. It's not like we're dogmatic to the degree that we say I'm right and you're wrong. But it's not a relativist position either, because that's intellectually sophomoric. But rather we say the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. The ways in which we then approach these poems is going to inform our epistemological understanding as well. Now, let's think about this for a moment. What is it that great artists all do? Well, they have a tendency to do three things, I think. They have a tendency to very much understand how to look backwards. And in the process, they do some very interesting things with the stuff that came before. They have ways to tweak and change and grow in powerful ways. So that, for example, Dante will pick up his Aeneid and he'll play around with his Aeneid in really remarkable ways. He'll pick up his Ovid's Metamorphoses and he'll play with that as well. Number two, these great artists have a tendency to look inward. They will take very seriously the work of their own spiritual existence, their own intellectual experience, and somehow that begins to be a part of then their product, their artistic product. Finally, they have that ability to look forward in creative ways. This is why sometimes we've used that term integral, because they integrate everything that came before, subsume it in some kind of creative way, and then everything afterwards, the world doesn't look the same because of these great artists. The world is a different place after Michelangelo or Da Vinci. The same will be true, of course, of the people we've been working with. I mean, if you'll think about it, Homer leads to Virgil. Virgil leads, and in our study, right, Homer and Virgil in our study, then notice we went to Plato, then to St. Augustine, and then finally to Dante. And it works kind of well that way. Notice our dates as we played around with it in our Dante lecture. Of course, from Dante, you've got Chaucer, and then you've got Machiavelli. And from those two thinkers, then we'll find ourselves with Shakespeare, who we meet next, really influential. And then finally Milton. And in many ways, you can't have Milton and you can't have Shakespeare without those thinkers that preceded, especially in our case, Dante for this lecture. From there, of course, after Milton, you have the Romantics, who have that tendency to want to look back with nostalgia. Back to, in fact, Wordsworth will write in London, 1802, he will say to Milton, man, we need you. We need you in ways we don't even understand. And then from the Romantics in our study, we move to the Victorians and finally to the moderns, just to mention three that we'll be focusing on in Yeats, in James Joyce, and finally T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and Four Quartets. About all of those writers I just mentioned, we could point out several things right away, and we'll be self-critical as well as we do it. Notice, for example, and by the way, I will add to that list of Yeats and Joyce and Eliot, I will add as well Virginia Woolf will go there, as well as a good number of women writers. It will be, I think, significant, however, that we'll look at this list so easily and say, well, where are the female voices? Where are the women? That is an important question as we ask about our study of Dante's Inferno. Where are the women, and how significant is it that we so rarely see them, although Francesca's voice is given, right? Or the wife of Bath in Chaucer is given. But for the most part, we're going to ask some interesting questions about why is that the case, okay, as we go forward. Now let's turn to Dante, just in our final comments here. Dante, think of it. Dante is poet. Well, obviously he's extending everything from Homer to Virgil on, right? Poetically. Dante is politician. That Guelph-Ghibelline conflict is foundational to the way we read this text. Of course, Dante is philosopher. Well, ontologically, of course, he has very interesting ideas about who we are as physical beings, as spiritual beings, as emotional beings. Epistemologically as well, what it is that we know while we're alive, what it is that we can learn if we're a Dante the Pilgrim, for example, in an afterlife journey. Dante and psychology as a philosopher, think about that one, the individual mind. What is it that motivates us to do the things that we do from an individual perspective and then sociologically? Notice, hell is a place of a lot of people. And yet, down in hell, everybody is so narcissistic that Farinata doesn't even know that Cavalcante's in the same tune with him in Canto 10. Fascinating. Of course, no question, Dante has that backward-looking tendency to Homer and Virgil, no question to Plato, but we argued, most importantly, St. Augustine in his Confessions. Dante is very much inward-looking. Dante, the poet, trying to understand how he can escape and work and process through exile. The way he does it is through art. Dante, of course, looking philosophically, moves from the individual to the collective. It's Dante who really is the one who begins to argue. Every one of our actions has a ripple effect. Because the world that Dante's living in is a different kind of world than the world that, for example, Virgil was living in when he wrote the Aeneid. It's not the same world socioeconomically. It's not the same world, obviously, religiously. Of course, in terms of those spheres of value and influence, as we were talking about them, Dante, in terms of the arts, he obviously wants to challenge Homer. He uses the mythology of Homer and Virgil and Ovid, but he wants to go beyond it, and I think that's, we made comments about this. Dante, obviously, in the sphere of morals, this is an interesting text in that regards, right? In that, to that degree, it's an instructional text. It's a propedeutic. And one of the questions we ask is, can you quite literally scare the hell out of people? Can you scare people into, okay, I want to put a 45 slug in somebody, but I read in Dante's Inferno what it is that happens to those people, and therefore I'm not going to put the 45 slug. Of course, we've pointed out, it only works, hell, as a propedeutic if you believe in it, right? Once you stop believing in it, then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore for you. Of course, Dante in that realm of science, the idea, of course, that God ordains everything raises the question about whether we have choice or not. It's pretty clear, though, from the study of not only Inferno but Purgatorio and Paradiso, that Dante, following Augustine, wants to make a solid argument that there is such a thing as free will or choice. Of course, it culminates in our study of Milton's Paradise Lost. We'll get there. Okay, all of this and more, I think, make Dante the really important writer that we have claimed him to be. Now, the final question here is, where do we go from here? Well, we go to 1600. That's the date that we will write down. From 1300 to 1600, that 300 years difference in span, roughly the time of our country as I'm giving this lecture. Shakespeare, 300 years after Dante, the world has changed radically. Right? Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, 8 years from 1500, 100 years from 1600. So you can kind of get a sense of that. The British will defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. So you can get a sense of kind of your timeline and your dates. Of course, at 1600 with Shakespeare, we qualify this as the Elizabethan age or the Renaissance. We'll have more to say about that one. And the differentiation, the process, the beginning of the differentiation of those value spheres of arts, morals, and science. Before the Renaissance, we have that time we call the Dark Ages. Of course, we give these names to these ages long after the fact, right? The Dark Ages. But what does that mean? It means the church has total power in the three domains of arts, morals, and science. That is to say, Michelangelo does what Michelangelo does, but he does it predominantly for the church. The church has the power over what he says and does. Okay? By the time of Shakespeare, we're going to begin to see the arts, the morals, and the science starting to pull away. And the criticism, obviously, of the church will become a huge part of what Shakespeare's going to do. Obviously, there's a reason why Shakespeare's theater gets shut down several times. And guess who it's by? Usually religious people, right? They begin to get concerned. Now, this separation or this differentiation of these three value spheres will culminate in what we call the Age of Reason or the Scientific Enlightenment, the invention of scientific method. We'll look to somebody like Francis Bacon to be, and Newton obviously, to be a major voice of that movement. But a lot of it begins, I want to argue, a lot of it begins with the people that we've studied, especially Dante and then Machiavelli, and of course, no question, Chaucer. And it will come to its fruition through Shakespeare as we move then towards Francis Bacon and Newton, no question about it. Of course, in the end, Shakespeare is going to ask serious questions about theodicy. Why is it that bad stuff seems to happen to quote-unquote good people, right? He's going to ask and challenge us in those four areas of ontology, epistemology, who we are, and what we can know and what we can't know. What are the limits of our knowledge? Psychology, why do we behave individually the way we behave? And finally, sociology, why is it that groups behave the way that they behave? After Shakespeare, the world will never be the same again. But then, of course, we could have said that about any one of the writers we've messed with. We could have said that about Homer, definitely said that about Virgil, and now after our study of Dante, say that about Dante. I welcome you now to our second half of our AP course and the study of Shakespeare, the first true modern. Thank you.